Elena Voss froze with her hand still on the medication cart, staring at the numbers on the screen in front of her. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The dosage typed into the surgical order for the patient in room 4 was almost triple what it should have been. Her heart began to pound. There was no time to waste. She turned and walked fast toward the operating room, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor, her mind racing through every reason this could be a simple mistake, and every reason it could turn into a disaster. Inside the operating room, Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood over the patient with his team gathered around him, already prepping for the procedure. He was the kind of surgeon whose name appeared on hospital brochures, the kind of man who walked through hallways like he owned them. Elena pushed the door open, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Dr. Whitfield, I need to flag something before you begin. The dosage listed for the anesthesia is incorrect. It could cause serious harm." The room went still. Every nurse, every technician, every resident turned to look at her, then at him. Whitfield did not even glance at the chart. He looked at her the way someone looks at an insect that has wandered somewhere it does not belong. "You're just a nurse," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the sterile air. "Stick to fetching charts and let the people who actually went to medical school make the decisions." A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Nobody spoke up. Elena felt her face grow hot, but she did not move. She did not look away from him either. Years of training, years of experience, years of standing beside soldiers bleeding out in places far worse than this clean, well-lit room, had taught her one thing above all else. When something is wrong, you do not back down just because someone with more letters after their name tells you to. "With respect, sir, I am required to document this concern regardless of your response," she said, and before he could answer, she turned and walked out, already reaching for her tablet to log the discrepancy through the hospital's official reporting system. Behind her, she heard him mutter something to his team, followed by a ripple of nervous laughter. She did not turn around. She had learned long ago that laughter used to cover embarrassment was louder than it needed to be, and quieter people usually remembered more than the ones laughing. By the time she reached the nurse's station, her hands were shaking, though her face remained calm. Priya Nair, the nurse who had worked beside her for the past 4 years, looked up from her computer and immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" Priya asked, already standing. "Whitfield," Elena said, as if that one word explained everything. In many ways, it did. "What did he do this time?" Elena told her quickly, keeping her voice low so it would not carry across the ward. Priya's expression darkened with each sentence, her jaw tightening the way it always did when she heard about a doctor treating nurses like they were invisible. "You reported it, right?" "Already logged it," Elena said. "If that dosage had gone through, that patient could have gone into cardiac arrest on the table. I don't care how many awards hang on his office wall. I am not staying quiet when a life is at risk." Priya reached out and squeezed her arm. "You did the right thing. You always do." Elena managed a small, tired smile, but the sting of the moment stayed with her as she moved through the rest of her shift, checking vitals, changing dressings, comforting a frightened teenager who had come in after a bicycle accident. The work never stopped, and in a strange way, she was grateful for that. It gave her something to focus on besides the humiliation still burning quietly beneath her calm exterior. What she did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the patient scheduled for surgery that afternoon, the man whose chart she had flagged, was not just any patient. His name was Edward Marsh, a retired schoolteacher, quiet and unassuming, recovering from injuries sustained in a car accident 3 days earlier. He had been transferred to Ashford Memorial after the local clinic near his home could not handle the complexity of his case. He had one son. That son happened to be a 4-star general in the United States military, a man whose name carried weight in rooms far more powerful than any hospital boardroom. Nobody at Ashford Memorial knew this yet. To them, Edward Marsh was simply the elderly man in room 4 with a fractured hip and internal bruising. His paperwork listed a single emergency contact, a phone number with a military exchange that nobody had bothered to call directly, since Edward himself, stubborn and proud even while in pain, had insisted his son not be bothered unless it was truly necessary. But word travels fast in families that understand duty. A cousin who worked as an administrative assistant at the hospital had already sent a message earlier that morning, letting the family know that Edward had been moved for surgery. That message eventually reached General Daniel Marsh at a base several states away. interrupting a meeting he had been sitting through for the better part of an hour. He read the message twice, set down his pen, and without a word to his staff, began making arrangements to fly out that same day. Back at the hospital, Elena had no way of knowing any of this. She continued her rounds, checking on Edward Marsh briefly, before his scheduled procedure was postponed, while the hospital pharmacy reviewed the dosage discrepancy she had flagged. When she stepped into his room to check his vitals, he was sitting up slightly, his silver hair neatly combed despite the circumstances, his eyes sharp and alert. "You're the one who caught the mistake," he said, before she could even introduce herself. "I heard the nurses talking outside." Elena smiled gently. "Just doing my job, Mr. Marsh." "Doing your job well, from what I hear," he said. "That surgeon give you trouble?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much to share with a patient. "It's handled," she said simply. Edward studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he understood far more than he was letting on. "People like that," he said. "The loud ones who think a title makes them untouchable. They usually meet someone eventually who reminds them it doesn't." Elena did not know what to say to that, so she simply checked his blood pressure, noted it on her tablet, and told him the surgical team would update him as soon as the dosage issue was resolved. She left the room without dwelling on his words, unaware of how soon they would prove true, and unaware of just how close that reminder was already flying toward Ashford Memorial. The afternoon moved forward in its usual rhythm, patients arriving and leaving, calls to the pharmacy, quiet conversations in the break room where nobody quite said Whitfield's name out loud, but everyone understood who they were talking about. Elena tried to push the incident from her mind, focusing instead on her patients, on the small acts of comfort and care that had drawn her into nursing in the first place. But somewhere beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered, the kind that comes from knowing an unresolved conflict rarely stays unresolved for long. She had no idea that by the end of the day, everything at Ashford Memorial would change, and that the man walking through the front doors in a few hours would know her not as a nurse who had been humiliated in an operating room, but as someone who had once kept him and his soldiers alive when the odds were stacked entirely against them. At the nurse's station, the pharmacy called back with confirmation. The dosage on Edward Marsh's chart had indeed been entered incorrectly, a transcription error that, if left uncorrected, could have caused a dangerous drop in his heart rate during surgery. The corrected order was sent through, and the operating room schedule was adjusted to accommodate the delay. Word of the correction moved quietly through the surgical wing, though nobody made a formal announcement. In hospitals, some victories are quiet ones, noted only in charts, and in the relief of the people who caught the mistake before it became a tragedy. Whitfield, for his part, said nothing further about the incident. He signed off on the corrected order without comment, though the tightness in his jaw told anyone paying attention that he did not appreciate being proven wrong, especially not by someone he had dismissed so easily in front of his team. He moved on to his next patient as though nothing had happened, the way men like him always did, certain that his reputation would smooth over any wrinkle before it had the chance to matter. Elena, meanwhile, finished charting her notes and allowed herself a small breath of relief. The patient was safe. That was what mattered most. More than her pride. More than the sting of being spoken to like she was beneath consideration in a room full of people who knew better. She had seen worse. She had survived worse. A surgeon with an ego was nothing compared to what she had faced years earlier, in places where mistakes were measured not in embarrassment, but in lives lost within seconds. She checked the clock above the nurse's station. 3 more hours left in her shift. She had no way of knowing that before those 3 hours were over, the entire hospital would be talking about her, not because of the mistake she had caught, but because of the man who was about to walk through the front doors asking for her by name. Outside, beyond the sliding glass doors of Ashford Memorial, a black sedan pulled into the visitor lot, arriving faster than the posted speed limit allowed. A man stepped out, tall and composed, dressed in a uniform that immediately drew the attention of everyone near the entrance. He did not stop to admire the building or ask for directions. He walked straight toward the front desk, with the kind of purpose that made people instinctively step aside, his eyes already scanning the directory board for the surgical wing, his mind fixed on one name, and one name only, his father. And somewhere down that hallway, without either of them knowing it yet, a familiar face from his past was about to reappear in his life, at the exact moment he needed her most. General Daniel Marsh moved through the hospital lobby like a man who had walked into far more dangerous places than this. His boots struck the polished floor in a steady rhythm. His shoulders squared beneath a uniform lined with ribbons and 4 silver stars that immediately caught the attention of everyone he passed. A woman at the front desk stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. "General, sir, how can I help you?" "Edward Marsh," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, the voice of a man used to being answered quickly and clearly. "He was brought in 3 days ago. Car accident. I need his room number." The receptionist typed quickly, her fingers trembling slightly under the weight of his presence. "Room 411, sir. Surgical wing, 2nd floor. I can call ahead and let them know you're coming." "Not necessary," Daniel said, already turning toward the elevators. "But thank you." He rode up in silence, standing perfectly still, his jaw tight with a mixture of worry and restrained anger. He had received the message about his father's accident 3 days ago, while overseeing training exercises far from home, and had spent every hour since then coordinating flights, rearranging responsibilities, and forcing himself to remain calm despite the distance between himself and the one person who had raised him after his mother passed away when he was young. Edward Marsh had never asked for much in his life. He had spent 40 years teaching history to teenagers who rarely appreciated it at the time, coaching youth baseball on weekends, and writing his son a letter every single week Daniel had been deployed, without fail, rain or shine, war or peace. The idea that his father might have been in danger inside this hospital, and that Daniel had not been here to make sure everything was being handled properly, gnawed at him the entire flight over. When the elevator doors opened on the 2nd floor, he stepped out and immediately scanned the corridor for signage. A young nurse walking past nearly dropped her clipboard when she saw him, quickly straightening and pointing him toward room 411, without needing to be asked. He thanked her with a short nod and continued walking, his pace quickening slightly as he neared his father's door. Inside, Edward Marsh was propped up against a stack of pillows, looking tired but alert, a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on the tray beside him. When he saw his son standing in the doorway, his face broke into a wide, relieved smile. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Edward said, his voice warm despite the teasing edge. "Took you long enough." Daniel crossed the room in 3 quick strides and gently took his father's hand, careful not to disturb the intravenous line taped to his skin. "You scared me, old man, you know that?" "It takes more than a fender bender to put me down," Edward said, though the bruising along his temple and the brace around his midsection told a more serious story than he was letting on. "I'm fine. A little banged up, but fine." "The doctor said you needed surgery," Daniel said, pulling a chair closer to the bed and sitting down, still holding his father's hand. "Internal bleeding. That's not a fender bender, Dad." Edward waved a hand dismissively, though the motion clearly caused him some discomfort. "They caught it in time. Some sharp nurse noticed a mistake in my medication order before it went too far. Probably saved me a lot of trouble." Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. "What mistake?" "Wrong dosage on the anesthesia," Edward said. "Could have caused my heart to slow down too much during the procedure, from what I understand. The surgeon didn't want to hear it at first, from what the nurses were saying outside my door, but she stood her ground and reported it anyway. Corrected before anything happened." Daniel leaned back slightly, processing this. In his world, in the military, the difference between a mistake caught in time and a mistake missed was often the difference between life and death. He had seen soldiers survive impossible situations because someone junior in rank had the courage to speak up when something felt wrong, and he had seen tragedies unfold because pride or hierarchy silenced the person who noticed the danger first. The fact that a nurse in this hospital had done exactly what his own soldiers were trained to do, speak the truth even when it was unwelcome, struck a chord in him that went far deeper than simple gratitude. "Do you know her name?" he asked. Edward thought for a moment. "Voss, I believe. Elena Voss. Seemed to know her way around a hospital better than most doctors I've met." The name landed on Daniel like a physical weight. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he simply sat there, staring at his father as though he had misheard him. "Elena Voss," he repeated slowly. "You know her?" Edward asked, noticing the change in his son's expression. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "If it's the same Elena Voss I'm thinking of, then yes, I know her very well. She served under my command years ago, in a combat support unit overseas. She was one of the best combat nurses I have ever worked with. There was an incident, a convoy ambush, 3 of my soldiers wounded badly, and the base medical tent was overwhelmed. She kept 2 of them alive with almost nothing, working through gunfire, refusing to leave her post even when ordered to seek cover. I put her in for a commendation myself. I never got the chance to properly thank her before she left the service. Edward's eyebrows rose in surprise. Small world. Too small to be a coincidence, Daniel murmured, already standing up from his chair, his mind working through the implications. If this was truly the same woman, then somewhere in this hospital was someone who had once saved the lives of men under his command, someone whose skill and courage he had personally witnessed in the worst conditions imaginable, and she had just been treated with disrespect by a surgeon who apparently believed her expertise did not matter simply because of her title. "Where are you going?" Edward asked, as his son moved toward the door. "I want to see her," Daniel said. "I want to know if it's really her." He stepped out into the hallway and approached the nurse's station, where Priya was reviewing a chart. She looked up and immediately straightened at the sight of him, the same reaction he had grown used to over the years, though it never stopped feeling slightly strange to him. Rank meant something different depending on which world you stood in, and here, in a hospital, his stars carried a different kind of weight than they did on a base. "General, is there something I can help you with? I'm looking for a nurse named Elena Voss," he said. "I understand she's caring for my father, Edward Marsh, in room 411. Priya blinked, surprised. "Elena? Yes, she's on this floor. She actually just stepped away for a supply run, but she should be back any minute. Would you like me to page her?" "No need," Daniel said. "I'll wait." He stood near the nurse's station, his posture straight, his eyes occasionally drifting down the hallway. A few minutes passed, long enough for a small crowd of curiosity to gather quietly among the staff, nurses and technicians finding excuses to walk past the station, glancing at the 4 stars on his shoulder and whispering among themselves. Word traveled fast in hospitals, faster than most people realized, and by the time Elena rounded the corner pushing a small cart of supplies, half the floor already knew that a general was standing near the nurse's station, asking for her by name. Elena stopped mid-step the moment she saw him. For a brief second, her mind struggled to place him, the uniform triggering a flood of memories she had not touched in years, memories of dust and heat, and the sound of gunfire echoing against canvas walls. Then recognition hit her all at once, and her breath caught in her throat. "Colonel Marsh?" she said, then quickly corrected herself, noticing the additional stars. "General Marsh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had been promoted since I last saw you." Daniel's face broke into a genuine smile, the tension of the past few hours easing slightly at the sight of her. "It's been a long time, Lieutenant Voss." "It's just Elena now," she said, setting down the supply cart, still slightly stunned. "I left the service 4 years ago." "The Army's loss," Daniel said, "though clearly this hospital's gain." Elena felt a small, unexpected warmth at his words, especially after the humiliation she had endured earlier that day. "What are you doing here, sir? I mean, General." "My father," Daniel said, his expression shifting into something more serious. "Edward Marsh, room 411. He told me you were the one who caught a dangerous mistake in his medication order." Understanding dawned across Elena's face, along with a flicker of surprise. "He's your father?" "He is," Daniel confirmed. "And apparently, once again, you've saved someone I care about." Elena shook her head slightly, though a small, tired smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I was just doing my job." "You've always said that," Daniel replied. "Even after the ambush, when you kept 2 of my soldiers breathing until the evacuation helicopter arrived, you told me the same thing. Just doing my job. I don't think you understand how rare that kind of dedication is, Elena. Not everyone runs toward danger to save people who aren't even asking for help." Elena's throat tightened slightly at the memory, the weight of that day never fully leaving her, even years later. "How is your father doing?" "Stable," Daniel said. "Recovering. Frustrated that he can't finish his crossword puzzle fast enough, but stable." A small laugh escaped Elena despite herself, the tension of the day finally beginning to loosen its grip on her shoulders. For the first time since Whitfield's harsh words in the operating room, she felt something close to being seen, truly seen, not just as a nurse fetching charts and following orders, but as someone whose judgment and courage genuinely mattered. But the moment did not last long. Priya, still standing nearby, hesitated before speaking up, clearly uncertain whether she should say anything at all. "General, sir, if you don't mind me asking," Priya said carefully, "did you happen to hear about what happened earlier today, before the mistake was caught?" Daniel's expression sharpened immediately, sensing there was more to this story than his father had shared. "No, what happened?" Priya glanced at Elena, silently asking permission. Elena hesitated, unsure whether she wanted to relive the humiliation of that morning, especially in front of someone whose respect she had just regained after all these years. But something in Daniel's steady, patient gaze told her he genuinely wanted to know, not out of gossip, but out of a real desire to understand what had happened to the woman who had once saved his soldiers. "There was an incident," Elena said slowly, "with one of the surgeons, Dr. Whitfield. When I flagged the dosage error, he dismissed me in front of the entire operating room, told me I was just a nurse and should stick to fetching charts." Daniel's expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes hardened, a familiar coldness settling into his features that Elena remembered from the battlefield, the look he wore whenever he learned that someone under his protection had been mistreated. "He said that to you," Daniel repeated quietly, "after you caught a mistake that could have killed my father." "It's not the first time something like that has happened," Elena said, choosing her words carefully. "It comes with the job sometimes. I filed the report and moved on." "You shouldn't have to just move on," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "Not from something like that. Not after everything you've done, both here and overseas." Elena did not know how to respond to that. She had spent years learning to absorb these moments quietly, to protect her own peace by refusing to let disrespect define her days. But standing there, facing a man who had once trusted her with the lives of his soldiers, she felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the armor she had built around herself. "It's handled," she said again, echoing her earlier words to Priya, though this time they felt less convincing, even to her own ears. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he was far from finished with the matter. "I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge of this hospital," he said. "Today, if possible." Priya's eyes widened slightly, and even Elena felt a flicker of alarm at the request. "General, that's really not necessary. I appreciate the thought, but I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be." "With respect, Elena," Daniel said, his tone gentle but unwavering, "this isn't just about you. It's about every nurse in this hospital who might catch a life-threatening mistake tomorrow and think twice about speaking up because they're afraid of being humiliated for it. That's not something I can simply walk past, especially not after what you did for my soldiers and what you just did for my father." Elena opened her mouth to argue further, but something in his expression told her this was not a battle she was going to win. She had seen that same look on his face years ago, moments before he made a decision that no one in the room dared to question. It was the look of a man who had already made up his mind, and who fully intended to see it through. "I'll see what I can arrange," Priya said quietly, already reaching for the phone at the nurse's station, sensing that whatever was about to happen next was far bigger than a simple conversation. Elena stood there, caught somewhere between gratitude and apprehension, watching as General Daniel Marsh straightened his uniform and glanced toward the hallway leading to the administrative offices. Whatever quiet resolution she had hoped for after the morning's humiliation, it was clear now that the day was far from over, and that the next conversation happening in this hospital would involve far more than just a corrected medication order. Karen Bell, the hospital administrator, had been in the middle of reviewing quarterly budget reports when her assistant knocked on the door and informed her, in a slightly shaky voice, that a 4-star general was waiting in the front office and had requested a meeting immediately. Karen had managed Ashford Memorial for nearly a decade, and in that time she had handled angry family members, difficult board meetings, and more than one lawsuit threat, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for a visit like this. She straightened her blazer, took a steadying breath, and walked out to greet him personally. "General Marsh," she said, extending a hand. "Karen Bell, hospital administrator. I understand your father is one of our patients. I hope he's being well cared for." "He is," Daniel said, shaking her hand firmly. "Thanks to one of your nurses, that's actually what I'd like to discuss with you, if you have a few minutes." Karen led him into her office, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. Though Daniel remained standing near the window, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back in a stance Karen recognized from years of watching military dramas, though she had never expected to see it in person, in her own office. "I'm listening," she said, taking her seat. "Earlier today, one of your nurses, Elena Voss, identified a dangerous medication error before my father's surgery. Had that error gone unnoticed, he could have suffered serious cardiac complications during the procedure. She flagged it immediately, through the proper channels, exactly as she should have." "That's good to hear," Karen said carefully, sensing there was more to the story. "Our nurses are trained to catch exactly that kind of discrepancy." "I agree," Daniel said, "which is why I find it troubling that when she raised her concern to the surgeon overseeing the procedure, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, he dismissed her in front of the entire operating room, told her she was just a nurse, and implied her judgment did not matter." Karen's expression shifted, the professional calm faltering slightly. She had heard whispers over the years about Whitfield's temperament, complaints filed and quietly settled, incidents smoothed over because of his reputation, and the revenue his surgical department brought to the hospital. But those complaints had always stayed contained, handled behind closed doors, never escalating to something that reached her office with this level of urgency. "General, I want to assure you that we take these matters seriously," Karen said. "I will personally look into this incident." "I'd like more than an assurance," Daniel said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I served with Elena Voss overseas. I watched her save the lives of soldiers under my command, in conditions far more dangerous than anything inside these walls. Her instincts, her judgment, and her courage have never been in question, not once, in all the years I've known her. If a surgeon in this hospital cannot recognize that kind of expertise when it's standing right in front of him, then perhaps the problem isn't with the nurses raising concerns. Perhaps it's with a culture that allows arrogance to silence people who are simply trying to keep patients alive." Karen sat back slightly, absorbing the weight of his words. She had built her career on protecting the hospital's reputation, on smoothing over conflicts before they became public relations problems, but something about the conviction in Daniel's voice made it clear that this particular issue was not going to be smoothed over quietly, not this time. "I understand your concern," she said. "Let me pull the incident report and speak with the staff who witnessed what happened. I take patient safety and staff treatment very seriously." "I appreciate that," Daniel said, "but I'd also like to understand how many times something like this has happened before. Because, if this is the first complaint against Dr. Whitfield, that's one conversation. If it's the 10th, that's an entirely different problem, one that speaks to how this hospital operates when the person causing harm happens to bring in a lot of money." Karen hesitated, and that hesitation told Daniel everything he needed to know. She reached for her phone, dialing an internal extension. "Get me the personnel file for Dr. Marcus Whitfield," she said quietly, "and pull any complaints filed against him in the past 3 years. While they waited, Karen studied the man standing across from her, noting the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way he seemed to fill the room, without raising his voice or making a single dramatic gesture. She had met plenty of powerful people over the years. Executives, board members, wealthy donors who expected their opinions to carry extra weight simply because of their bank accounts. This felt different. This felt like a man who genuinely cared about the outcome, not because of his own reputation, but because of a debt he clearly felt he owed to someone who had once saved lives under his command. A few minutes later, her assistant returned with a folder, setting it carefully on the desk. Karen opened it, her eyes scanning the pages quickly, her expression growing more troubled with each line. There were 5 prior complaints against Whitfield over the past 3 years, all involving similar behavior, dismissive comments toward nursing staff, at least 2 incidents where nurses had flagged concerns that were later proven correct, and one particularly troubling case, where a formal grievance had been filed, but quietly withdrawn, after the nurse involved was transferred to a different department. "This is more extensive than I realized," Karen admitted, closing the folder. "I wasn't aware of the full pattern here." "Someone was," Daniel said quietly. "Someone chose not to look too closely, because looking closely would have meant confronting a surgeon who brings prestige and revenue to this hospital. I understand the pressures administrators face, Ms. Bell. I've had to make difficult decisions myself, balancing the needs of an organization against the needs of the individuals within it. But there's a line, and when a pattern of behavior starts putting patients at risk because staff are afraid to speak up, that line has been crossed. Karen nodded slowly, the weight of the situation settling over her. She thought of the countless times she had prioritized smooth operations over uncomfortable confrontations, told herself that isolated incidents did not warrant sweeping action, that surgeons like Whitfield were simply difficult personalities rather than genuine liabilities. Sitting here now, staring at a folder full of evidence she had allowed herself to overlook, she realized how easily that reasoning could collapse under real scrutiny. "I'll open a formal review," Karen said, effective immediately. "I'll need statements from everyone present in the operating room today, as well as anyone involved in the prior complaints. Dr. Whitfield will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." "That's a good start," Daniel said. "But I'd also like to know what protections exist for nurses like Elena, the ones who do exactly what they're trained to do and end up humiliated for it. What happens after this review concludes? Does she simply go back to work tomorrow as though nothing happened, waiting for the next surgeon to treat her the same way?" Karen considered the question carefully. She thought about the culture she had allowed to persist within her own hospital, one where senior physicians could speak to nursing staff with contempt and face little more than a quiet reprimand, while the nurses who caught life-threatening errors received nothing but a passing mention in a chart note. It was not a culture she was proud of, and hearing it laid out so plainly by someone with no stake in the hospital's internal politics made the problem impossible to ignore. "I think it's time we created something more permanent," Karen said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. "A formal position, someone with the authority to review clinical safety concerns hospital-wide, someone who reports directly to administration rather than being subject to the whims of individual department heads, someone whose judgment has already been proven, repeatedly, under pressure." Daniel's expression softened slightly, the first sign of real satisfaction crossing his face since he had walked into the office. "That sounds like exactly what this hospital needs." "I'll need to discuss it with the board," Karen said, "but I don't anticipate resistance, not after they see this file, and not after they understand the potential liability this hospital has been carrying by allowing this pattern to continue unchecked." As their conversation continued, neither of them noticed the quiet knock at the door, nor the figure standing just outside it, having been summoned by Karen's assistant without fully understanding why. Marcus Whitfield stood in the hallway, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of confusion and mounting irritation as he waited to be called in, unaware that the conversation happening on the other side of that door was about to unravel a reputation he had spent decades building. When Karen finally opened the door and invited him inside, Whitfield stepped in with the same confident stride he carried into every operating room, though his confidence faltered slightly the moment he saw General Daniel Marsh standing near the window, watching him with an expression that gave away nothing. "Miss Bell, I was told this was urgent," Whitfield said, glancing between the administrator and the uniformed stranger. "Is everything all right?" "Please, sit down, Dr. Whitfield," Karen said, her tone carefully neutral. "We need to discuss an incident that occurred earlier today, involving one of our nursing staff." Whitfield's eyes flicked toward Daniel again, a flicker of understanding beginning to dawn on his face, though he masked it quickly with practiced composure. "I assume this is about Nurse Voss." "It is," Karen confirmed. "General Marsh here is the son of the patient involved. He's brought some concerns to my attention, concerns that align with several previous complaints filed against you over the past 3 years. Whitfield's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack in his composure appearing as he realized the scope of what was happening. "With all due respect, I don't see why my professional conduct in a single operating room is being discussed with a family member of a patient, regardless of his rank." "You don't see why," Daniel repeated slowly, turning fully to face him for the first time. "Let me help you understand. Earlier today, a nurse identified a life-threatening error in my father's medication order. Instead of thanking her for potentially saving his life, you humiliated her in front of an entire surgical team, told her she was just a nurse, and dismissed her concerns without so much as glancing at the chart. That error was confirmed. She was right. You were wrong. And your response to being wrong was contempt." Whitfield's face reddened slightly, though he attempted to hold his ground. "I have performed thousands of successful surgeries at this hospital. My judgment in that room is not something that should be second-guessed by nursing staff without the appropriate qualifications to override a physician's decisions. Her qualifications were exactly what caught your mistake, Karen said sharply, her patience clearly wearing thin. This isn't about hierarchy, Dr. Whitfield. It's about patient safety. And based on the file in front of me, this is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, one that has apparently gone unaddressed for far too long. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of hospital activity beyond the closed door. Whitfield looked between the two of them, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, a grudging awareness that the ground beneath his reputation had shifted in ways he had not anticipated when he woke up that morning. "What exactly is being proposed here?" he asked finally, his voice tighter than before. "A formal review of your conduct," Karen said. "Effective immediately, you will be placed on administrative leave while we investigate the full pattern of complaints against you, along with today's incident. Depending on the outcome, this could range from mandatory retraining to more serious consequences." Whitfield opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, seeming to recognize that further argument would only make his position worse. He glanced once more at Daniel, his eyes narrowing slightly, though whatever bitterness he felt remained unspoken, swallowed beneath the realization that he had badly underestimated the consequences of his own arrogance. As Whitfield left the office, his shoulders noticeably less confident than when he had entered, Karen turned back to Daniel, a look of quiet resolve settling over her features. "I'll make sure this is handled properly," she said, "thoroughly and fairly." "I trust you will," Daniel said. "And Ms. Bell, thank you for listening. Not every administrator would have taken this seriously." "Every administrator should," Karen replied. "I'm simply sorry it took someone with your rank walking through my door for me to look closely enough to see it." Outside the office, unaware of everything that had just unfolded on her behalf, Elena continued her rounds, checking vitals, updating charts, and comforting patients, carrying the quiet weight of the morning's humiliation with the same steady composure she always did. She had no idea that within the hour, her entire career at Ashford Memorial was about to change in ways she never could have anticipated. News of Whitfield's administrative leave spread through the hospital faster than any official announcement could have managed. By the time Elena finished checking on a patient in room 318, 2 other nurses had already stopped her in the hallway, eyes wide, asking if she had heard what happened. She hadn't. She listened with growing disbelief as they explained, piecing together fragments of the story, that Whitfield had been removed from surgical duties pending an investigation, and that a general had personally met with the hospital administrator that afternoon. "They're saying it's about you," one of the nurses said, her voice hushed with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "About what happened this morning." Elena felt her stomach tighten. This was not what she had wanted. She had reported the medication error because it was the right thing to do, not because she wanted to see anyone lose their position, not because she wanted to become the center of hospital gossip. She thanked the nurses quickly and made her way toward the administrative wing, her mind racing through everything that could have happened since General Marsh had walked away from the nurses' station. Karen Bell's assistant spotted her approaching and waved her in immediately, as though she had been expected. Elena stepped into the office hesitantly, finding Karen seated behind her desk, the folder of complaints still open in front of her, and General Marsh standing near the window, his posture relaxed now in a way it had not been earlier that day. "Elena, please come in," Karen said, gesturing toward the empty chair. "I think it's time we discussed what happens next." Elena sat down slowly, glancing between the two of them. "I appreciate everything, truly, but I want to be clear that I never intended for this to escalate the way it apparently has. I filed a report because a patient's safety was at risk. That's all I was trying to do." "I understand that," Karen said, "and that's exactly why this matters so much. You did your job, correctly and courageously, and instead of being supported, you were humiliated. That's not something I can allow to continue happening in this hospital. Not to you, and not to anyone else who might be too afraid to speak up after seeing how you were treated." Helena remained quiet, absorbing the weight of the conversation, still uncertain how she felt about the sudden attention surrounding what she had considered a routine, if uncomfortable, part of her job. "I've reviewed the complaint history against Dr. Whitfield," Karen continued. "This is not the first time his behavior toward nursing staff has been flagged. It's the 6th, and in at least 2 of those previous incidents, The concerns raised by nurses were later proven correct, exactly like today. I should have caught this pattern long before now, and for that, I owe you, and every nurse on this floor, an apology. Thank you, Elena said quietly, though the words still felt strange to hear from someone in Karen's position. Apologies from hospital administration were rare, and genuine ones rarer still. I'd also like to discuss something with you, Karen continued, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. I've been considering creating a new position within the hospital, a role focused entirely on clinical safety oversight. Someone who would have the authority to review flagged concerns across every department. Someone whose judgment carries weight regardless of whether a physician agrees or disagrees with their assessment. I think you would be an excellent candidate for that role. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. Me? You, Karen confirmed. Your instincts today, and clearly on multiple occasions throughout your career, have proven reliable under pressure. That kind of judgment is exactly what this hospital needs in a position with real authority, rather than leaving it up to individual nurses to fight uphill battles against surgeons who don't want to be questioned. Elena glanced toward Daniel, who watched the exchange with a quiet, satisfied expression, though he said nothing, clearly allowing the conversation to unfold between the two women, without inserting himself further than he already had. I don't know what to say, Elena admitted. This is a lot to take in, all in one day. You don't need to decide right now, Karen said gently. Take some time to think it over. But I want you to know that regardless of what you decide, the review of Dr. Whitfield's conduct will proceed, and changes are coming to how this hospital handles situations like the one you experienced this morning. Elena nodded slowly, still processing everything, the whirlwind of the day settling over her in waves. She thought of the years she had spent quietly absorbing moments of disrespect, telling herself it was simply part of the job, that speaking up too loudly might cost her more than it was worth. Sitting in this office now, hearing an administrator acknowledge a pattern she had assumed would never be addressed, felt like something shifting beneath her feet, a foundation she had not realized was cracked until she saw it being repaired. As the meeting concluded, Karen stood and extended her hand, first to Elena, then to Daniel. Thank you both for bringing this to my attention. I'll be in touch soon with updates on the review. And Elena, please consider the position seriously. This hospital needs people like you in roles where your voice cannot be so easily dismissed. Elena shook her hand, still slightly overwhelmed, and followed Daniel out of the office and into the hallway. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of hospital activity filling the space between them. You didn't have to do all of this, Elena said finally, once they were alone near the elevators. Yes, I did, Daniel said simply. Do you remember what you told me, after the ambush, when I tried to thank you for saving my soldiers? Elena thought back, the memory surfacing slowly. I told you I was just doing what anyone in my position should have done. And I told you that not everyone would have done what you did, Daniel said. I meant it then, and I mean it now. People like you, who run toward danger instead of away from it, who speak the truth even when it's unwelcome, deserve to be protected, not humiliated. I couldn't walk past what happened to you this morning, not after everything you've already given, both to my soldiers and now to my father. Elena felt her throat tighten slightly, unexpected emotion rising after a day that had tested her composure in ways she had not anticipated. Thank you, she said quietly, for remembering, for caring enough to do something about it. I have a difficult time forgetting people who save lives, Daniel said, a small, genuine smile crossing his face, especially people who do it more than once. They walked together toward the elevators, the tension of the day beginning to ease into something quieter, something closer to relief. As they waited for the doors to open, Priya approached from down the hallway, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Elena, is it true? She asked. About Whitfield? It's true, Elena confirmed. He's on administrative leave pending a review. Priya's eyes widened. I can't believe it. After everything, after all those years of him treating people like they don't matter, someone finally did something about it. It wasn't just me, Elena said, glancing toward Daniel. It took the right person being in the right place at the right time, or the right person recognizing the value of someone who had been overlooked for far too long, Daniel added. Priya smiled, shaking her head slightly in disbelief. Well, whatever happened, I'm glad it did. This floor has needed a change like this for years. As the elevator doors opened and Priya stepped inside, promising to update the rest of the staff, Elena remained standing near the nurses' station, watching Daniel glance toward his father's room down the hallway. I should get back to him, Daniel said. He'll want a full report on everything that happened while he was stuck in bed, unable to see any of it. Elena laughed softly, the sound genuine despite the exhaustion of the day. Tell him I said thank you for mentioning me to you. I don't think any of this would have happened otherwise. I will, Daniel said, though something tells me he already suspected there was more to this story than a simple medication error. He's always had a knack for noticing things other people miss. As Daniel turned to walk back toward his father's room, Elena remained standing near the station for a moment longer, watching him go, the weight of the day finally beginning to settle into something that felt less like exhaustion and more like quiet, hard-earned relief. She had come into work that morning expecting nothing more than a routine shift, another day of quiet competence overshadowed by someone else's arrogance. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of something entirely unexpected, a shift not just in her own career, but potentially in the culture of an entire hospital. She had no idea that the formal review into Whitfield's conduct would move faster than anyone anticipated, or that within days, the results would ripple far beyond Ashford Memorial's walls, reaching hospital networks across the region, and reshaping conversations about how medical staff treated one another, all beginning with a single moment of courage inside an operating room that morning. 3 weeks later, Elena stood outside a small conference room on the 3rd floor of Ashford Memorial, smoothing down the front of her new badge, one that no longer read simply nurse, but clinical safety advocate, a title that still felt slightly unfamiliar every time she said it out loud. The formal review into Marcus Whitfield's conduct had concluded faster than anyone expected, the weight of 6 documented complaints, combined with confirmed evidence from the medication incident, leaving little room for the hospital board to look the other way. Whitfield had been required to complete extensive retraining focused on communication and collaborative patient care, a mandatory condition for his continued employment, along with a formal written apology submitted to every nurse involved in the complaints, including Elena. She had read his apology once, sitting quietly in the break room during her lunch hour, and found it stiff and clearly written under pressure, though she recognized it for what it was, a necessary first step rather than a genuine transformation. Whether Whitfield had truly changed remained to be seen, but the hospital had changed around him, and that, Elena realized, mattered more than whether one man's ego had been fully humbled. Karen Bell had moved quickly to formalize the new safety advocate position, and after several days of consideration, long conversations with Priya, and one particularly encouraging phone call from Daniel before he returned to his post, Elena had accepted the role. Her responsibilities now extended beyond a single floor, giving her the authority to review flagged safety concerns across every department, with a direct line to hospital administration that could not be dismissed or buried the way individual nurse complaints so often had been in the past. Word of the changes at Ashford Memorial had spread beyond the hospital itself, first through local news coverage of the new Safety Advocate program, then through professional nursing networks eager to understand how the position had come to exist. Elena found herself fielding calls from other hospitals interested in replicating the model, a level of attention she had never anticipated and still felt slightly uncomfortable receiving, though she recognized the value in helping other institutions build similar protections for their staff. On this particular afternoon, she had been asked to speak briefly at a hospital-wide staff meeting, sharing her perspective on the changes and answering questions from nurses and physicians alike about how the new review process worked. She had never enjoyed public speaking, had spent most of her career finding comfort in the quiet, focused work of direct patient care rather than standing in front of a room full of colleagues. But as she stepped through the conference room doors and saw the room filled not just with nurses, but with physicians, surgical staff, and even a few administrators seated near the back, she felt a steady calm settle over her, the same calm that had carried her through combat zones and operating room confrontations alike. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, describing not just the incident that had led to the position's creation, but the broader pattern she had witnessed throughout her career, moments when nurses hesitated to speak up because the cost of being dismissed felt higher than the risk of staying silent. She explained how the new review process worked, how any staff member, regardless of title, could flag a safety concern that would be reviewed independently, without fear of retaliation from senior physicians who might otherwise dismiss their input. When she finished, a hand rose near the front of the room, a young nurse who could not have been more than a year or two into her career, her voice slightly nervous as she spoke. "What made you keep speaking up?" the young nurse asked. "Even after you were dismissed like that, weren't you afraid it would hurt your career?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Speaking up against someone with more authority than you is never easy, and it never stops feeling uncomfortable, no matter how many times you do it. But I learned a long time ago, in a much more dangerous place than this hospital, that silence costs more than discomfort ever could. If you see something wrong, and you stay quiet because you're worried about how someone will react, you're not protecting your career. You're gambling with someone else's life. That's not a trade I've ever been willing to make, and I hope none of you have to make it either. Not anymore. Not in this hospital." The room fell into a thoughtful silence, several nurses nodding slowly, a few physicians exchanging glances that suggested the message had landed exactly as intended. As the meeting concluded and staff began filing out of the conference room, Priya approached with a proud smile stretched across her face. "You were incredible up there," she said, pulling Elena into a quick hug. "I was terrified," Elena admitted, laughing softly. "Didn't look like it," Priya said. "Looked like someone who finally got to say everything she'd been holding back for years." Elena smiled, acknowledging the truth in that observation. As they walked together toward the nurses' station, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced down and felt a small, warm smile spread across her face at the sender's name. The message was from Daniel, sent from wherever his current assignment had taken him, a brief note letting her know that his father had made a full recovery and was already back to coaching youth baseball on weekends, much to the frustration of his physical therapist, who kept reminding him to take it easy. Attached to the message was a photograph: Edward Marsh, standing on a sunlit field, a baseball cap shading his eyes, looking every bit as stubborn and full of life as he had described himself during their brief hospital conversation weeks earlier. Elena typed back a short reply, thanking Daniel for the update, and telling him how glad she was to hear his father was doing well. Before she could set her phone aside, another message arrived, this one longer, expressing his gratitude once again for everything she had done, not just for his father, but for the changes now taking root throughout the hospital because of her courage. He ended the message with a simple line that stayed with her long after she had returned to her rounds that afternoon, a reminder that some debts, no matter how many years pass, are never truly forgotten by the people who owe them. As the weeks turned into months, Ashford Memorial continued to shift under the weight of its new safety culture. Nurses who once hesitated before flagging concerns now spoke up with growing confidence, knowing their voices carried weight, regardless of the title standing across from them. Whitfield, to his credit, completed his retraining and returned to surgical duties with a noticeably different demeanor, though few doubted that the change had come more from consequence than genuine reflection. Still, the incidence of dismissive behavior toward nursing staff dropped sharply across every department, a shift that Karen Bell often cited during board meetings as evidence that accountability, when applied consistently, could reshape even the most entrenched hospital cultures. Elena continued her work as clinical safety advocate, her days filled with reviewing flagged concerns, training new staff on proper reporting procedures, and occasionally standing in rooms far more official than any operating theater, advocating for the kind of respect and collaboration she had once been denied. She thought often of that morning weeks earlier, the sting of Whitfield's dismissal, the humiliation of standing alone in a room full of people who chose silence over solidarity. She never could have predicted that a single medication error, caught through nothing more than careful attention and years of hard-earned instinct, would ripple outward into something far larger than herself, reshaping not just her own career, but the culture of an entire institution. On a quiet evening several months later, as Elena walked through the parking lot toward her car after a long shift, she paused for a moment beneath the darkening sky, reflecting on everything that had changed since that tense morning in the operating room. She thought of Edward Marsh, recovering and stubborn as ever, of Daniel, wherever his duties had taken him next, of Priya, still standing beside her through every challenge, and of the countless nurses across the hospital who now felt empowered to speak up without fear. She had walked into that operating room weeks earlier as just a nurse, dismissed and unheard, her expertise reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience in the eyes of a man who valued hierarchy over honesty. She walked out of the hospital that evening as something far more significant, not because a title had changed, though it had, but because she had proven, once again, that courage and competence did not require permission to matter. Sometimes it simply took the right person walking through the right door, at exactly the right moment, to remind everyone else what had been true all along.